I heard my father's voice before I saw him. It carried across the crowded hall the way it always had, certain, unmovable, the kind of voice that expected the world to arrange itself around whatever he declared as truth. Only now it drifted above the low murmur of families and uniform bodies like a verdict already rendered. My daughter, she dropped out of the Navy after a few months, couldn't handle the pressure. He laughed, not cruelly, but with the casual ease of someone recounting a story he'd told so many times it had calcified into fact. But my son, Michael, now he's the real pride of the family. Today he receives the Distinguished Service Medal, the highest honor a SEAL can earn. I stood in the back row of the Naval Base Auditorium in San Diego, dressed in a simple navy blazer and black slacks. No jewelry except the Omega watch Michael had given me a decade ago. To anyone glancing my way, I looked like any other middle-aged woman attending a military ceremony. Perhaps a teacher, perhaps a retired nurse, perhaps someone's aunt who'd flown in for the occasion and would fly out again before anyone remembered her name. That was the point. I had spent most of my adult life learning how to occupy space without claiming it, how to be present without being visible when visibility served no strategic purpose. What my father didn't know, what he had never bothered to ask, was that the woman in the unremarkable outfit he'd just dismissed was Rear Admiral Morrison, one of the highest-ranking female intelligence officers in United States naval history. After 32 years of service, I had retired 6 months ago with a pension of $185,000 annually, more than double what he'd earned in his entire working life. The penthouse I'd purchased with cash in Alexandria, Virginia, was worth $2.4 million. My investment portfolio, built from classified bonuses and post-retirement consulting contracts, currently sat at $6.8 million. But none of that mattered to him because he had never asked. And I had stopped trying to explain 3 decades ago. The hall filled slowly. Flags stood at attention on either side of the stage, their colors deep and still under the fluorescent lights. Chairs were arranged in precise rows, 20 across, 25 deep, aligned so carefully that even the gaps between them looked intentional. The air smelled of floor polish and pressed fabric, that particular mixture of discipline and anticipation that only exists in military spaces before ceremonies begin. People don't come to events like this for entertainment. They come because they understand what it costs to stand on that stage. My family arrived together. My father, James Morrison, wore the same dark gray suit he reserved for church and funerals, the tie knotted with military precision, despite the fact that he'd left active duty 40 years ago. He moved through the crowd with the easy confidence of someone who believed he belonged anywhere he chose to be. Shoulders back, handshake firm, voice carrying. People responded to him the way people always had, with respect, with attention, with the assumption that a man who spoke with such certainty must have earned the right. My mother, Dorothy, walked half a step behind him in a pale floral dress, clutch purse held in both hands. She smiled at familiar faces, nodded at strangers, and kept her observations to herself. She had been doing that for 60 years. Michael stood with his wife Jessica and their 2 children near the front. Even out of uniform, he carried himself with the particular stillness that comes from years of training to move only when movement serves a purpose. His son Jake, 25, and daughter Emma, 22, both tall and healthy, looked around the hall with the mixture of pride and nervousness that comes from being young and present at something larger than themselves. I watched from my corner seat as my father greeted a man in a business suit, some local official, judging by the easy familiarity between them. "Mr. Morrison, you must be so proud, your son receiving the DSM. My father's smile widened. "I'm prouder than you can imagine. Michael's been special since he was a boy. Always knew he'd do something significant."
Do you have other children?
The pause was so brief, most people wouldn't have caught it. But I had spent 30 years reading micro-expressions in high-stakes negotiations. I saw the shift. "Yes, I have a daughter, Catherine. She was in the Navy too for a while." "Oh, she served as well. That's wonderful." My father's smile tightened just slightly at the edges. "Well, not exactly. She left after a few years. Couldn't handle it. You know how it is. Some people are built for this life, some aren't." He lowered his voice. Not quite a whisper, but pitched for discretion. She does something with education now, I think. Retired early. Lives alone in Virginia. Or maybe Maryland. We don't talk much. Talk. The official murmured something polite and noncommittal. My father continued. But Michael, look at him. That's the kind of son who makes a father's life worthwhile. Good income, solid family, distinguished career. That's what service looks like when it's done right. Good income. Michael earned $95,000 a year as a senior chief petty officer. A respectable sum, certainly. I earned $185,000 annually just from my pension, before accounting for the $6.8 million I'd accumulated through careful investment and the classified work I still consulted on. Solid career. Michael was a decorated non-commissioned officer, the backbone of any military operation. I had been a Rear Admiral, ranking above 99.9% of everyone who'd ever worn the uniform. But my father didn't know any of that. Because 30 years ago, when I tried to explain that I couldn't discuss my assignments, he'd decided that silence meant failure. And rather than admit he didn't understand his daughter's life, he'd invented one he could. I didn't feel anger anymore. Anger burns hot and fast, consuming everything until nothing remains but ash. What I felt was older than that, colder. The kind of settled grief that comes from accepting that some people will never see you, no matter how brightly you shine, because they've already decided what shape your light should take. The first time I understood this was in 1982, at a Sunday dinner when I was 15. I just received my SAT scores, 1,500 out of 1,600, placing me in the top 2% nationally. Michael, 12 at the time, had scored the winning goal in a youth soccer match that afternoon. When we sat down to eat, my father spent 20 minutes replaying every moment of Michael's game, complete with hand gestures and tactical analysis. Then he turned to me. And you, Katie? How was your week? I got my SAT results, 1,500 out of 1,600. He nodded absently, already cutting into his pot roast. That's fine. But, test scores don't help you find a good husband. My mother had reached across the table to pat my hand, her eyes holding something that might have been apology or might have been recognition. The look of a woman who had learned long ago which battles could be fought and which had to be endured in silence. She'd wanted to be a nurse once, before she married at 19 and folded that dream into a drawer she never opened again. That night, I'd lain in bed staring at my SAT certificate and understood something fundamental. My father didn't hate my success. He simply couldn't see it. Because in his architecture of the world, daughters weren't designed to succeed in ways that required acknowledgement. So when I decided to join the Navy 7 years later, I already knew how the conversation would go. It was May of 1989. I'd graduated from Georgetown University with a degree in international relations and a 3.9 GPA. 3 top-tier law firms had sent offers, starting salaries of $65,000, enormous money for a new graduate. My college roommate Sarah had accepted one immediately and spent weeks planning her move to Manhattan. We met for coffee at a Georgetown cafe 2 weeks before graduation. She was radiant, already planning her apartment, her wardrobe, her trajectory toward partner by 40. Kate, you should apply. With your grades, they'd snap you up. I stirred my coffee and watched the cream spiral. I want to do something that matters. Money isn't everything. She laughed, not unkindly. I know what you're thinking. You want to prove something to your dad. But Kate, he's never going to see it, no matter what you do. She was right, but I needed to try anyway. When I told my parents I'd enlisted in the Navy's officer candidate school, my father set down his newspaper and stared at me as if I'd announced plans to join the circus. You're joining the military? Why would you do that? I want to serve my country. Michael's going to serve. He's applying to the Naval Academy. He'll be a SEAL, the real deal. But you? He trailed off, searching for words. Women don't need to do this. Find a nice office job, meet someone decent, start a family. That's what your mother did, and it worked out fine. I glanced at my mother, who stood in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel twisted between her hands. Her eyes held that same unreadable expression from the SAT dinner, that mixture of things unsaid and unsayable. I've already signed the papers, Dad. I leave for Newport in September. He folded his newspaper with deliberate precision. Don't embarrass me, Catherine. If you're going to do this, at least finish what you start. I will. We'll see. Michael, home on leave from the Naval Academy, pulled me aside before I left for officer candidate school. He hugged me longer than usual. "You're going to be great, sis. It's going to be different for you than for me." "Different how?" He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "They're not going to let you do the really important stuff, because you're—" He didn't finish, but I understood. Because I was a woman. Because in 1989, despite everything that had changed, some doors still only open for certain people. "We'll see," I said, echoing our father's words with a different inflection entirely. Officer Candidate School in Newport, Rhode Island, stripped away every assumption about what strength looked like. I was one of 8 women in a class of 120. Our training officer, Lieutenant Commander Stevens, regarded us with the particular skepticism reserved for experiments he hadn't approved but was obligated to supervise. The physical requirements were brutal: 5-mile runs in formation, obstacle courses designed to test limits I hadn't known I possessed, ocean swims in water cold enough to steal breath. I wasn't the fastest runner. I wasn't the strongest climber. But I learned something crucial in those first weeks. The Navy didn't run on bravado. It ran on planning, coordination, and the kind of discipline that functioned without an audience. 3 months in, we were given a crisis simulation exercise. The scenario: a destroyer under attack, 3 compartments flooding, 47 crew members trapped, 20 minutes before the ship went under. As commanding officer, what's your decision? 23 male candidates presented variations of the same solution: heroic action, all-or-nothing rescue attempts, willingness to sacrifice themselves to save everyone. They spoke with passion, with conviction, with the kind of certainty that sounded impressive until you examined what it actually meant. When my turn came, I approached the problem differently. 3 compartments, 47 crew. Compartment A holds 15 people and is closest to escape routes. Compartment B holds 20, farther out. Compartment C holds 12, deepest in the hull. I paused, letting the math settle. With 20 minutes and available resources, attempting to rescue all compartments results in 0 survivors. We'd lose everyone trying to save everyone. I laid out my plan. Concentrate all resources on compartments A and B. 35 people saved in 15 minutes. Accept the loss of compartment C's 12 crew members to preserve the majority. The classroom erupted. Male voices overlapped in protest. "That's cowardice. You can't just abandon people. A real officer would find a way to save everyone." Lieutenant Commander Stevens let them talk themselves out. Then he raised one hand, and the room fell silent. "Candidate Morrison is correct." His voice held no warmth, but it held respect. "War isn't about heroes. It's about mathematics. 35 people alive is better than 0 people alive because you tried to be noble." After class, he called me to his office. He'd served for 25 years, commanded ships in 3 different theaters, seen more combat than most officers twice his age. "Morrison, I've trained thousands of officers. I'm going to tell you something, and you need to hear it." He leaned forward, hands folded on his desk. "You weren't built to stand on a ship's bridge and fire weapons. You were built to sit in secure rooms and decide which ships get to fire at all. Do you understand the difference?" "Yes, sir." "Good. I'm recommending you for the Strategic Intelligence Training Program. It's classified. You won't be able to tell your family where you're going or what you're doing, but it's where you belong." 3 months later, a gray envelope arrived with no return address. Inside, a single sheet. "Lieutenant Junior Grade Morrison, you are invited to participate in the Strategic Intelligence Training Program at Dam Neck, Virginia. Classification level, secret. Do not discuss with family or non-cleared personnel. Report January 15th, 1990. That was the moment my life stepped into shadow, and the moment I knew I would never be able to explain to my father what I actually did. The next 15 years became a study in absence and implication. I worked at the Naval Intelligence Center in Suitland, Maryland, analyzing satellite imagery of Soviet installations. I spent weeks in windowless rooms studying photographs of missile silos, naval bases, troop movements. The work required precision, patience, and the ability to see patterns in chaos. The ability to understand that 3 trucks in an unusual position might mean an entire brigade was about to mobilize. I missed Thanksgiving 1993 because of a crisis on the Korean Peninsula. I missed Christmas 1994 because intelligence suggested Serbia was planning offensives that would change the trajectory of the Balkans conflict. Each time I called home, the conversations followed the same pattern. "Where are you?" "I can't say, Dad." "What are you doing?" I can't discuss it. Can't or won't. The distinction mattered to him. To me, they were the same thing. By 995, he'd stopped asking. Instead, he filled the silence with assumptions. I found out later, in fragments through relatives who mentioned it with careful sympathy, that he'd been telling people I'd left the Navy, that I'd found military life too demanding, that I was working in education somewhere, and we weren't in close touch. I didn't correct him, partly because operational security forbade it, partly because I'd learned that some people need their narratives more than they need the truth. September 11, 2001, changed everything and nothing. I was a lieutenant commander stationed at the Pentagon, working in an office on the second floor. When the plane hit, the building shook like the earth was trying to shed us. Smoke filled corridors. People ran in directions they hoped led out. I helped evacuate my section. 23 people all accounted for, and then reported back because intelligence officers were needed immediately to process what came next. For 72 hours, I didn't sleep. We worked in shifts analyzing intercepts, satellite data, communications chatter, Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda, targets, responses. Every decision mattered because every decision would shape whether more buildings fell. My father called on the fourth day. "Katie, are you all right? I saw the Pentagon on the news." "I'm fine, Dad, just busy." "Can you come home for a few days? The country's in crisis. Surely they can spare you." I closed my eyes and pressed the phone harder against my ear. "I can't. I'm needed here." "For what?" Filing paperwork? The words landed like they always did. Not sharp enough to wound, just heavy enough to bruise. He genuinely believed I shuffled papers. He had no framework for imagining his daughter in a secure operations room, helping identify targets that would be struck by dawn. "I have to go, Dad. I'll call when I can," he sighed. "Michael's unit is deploying. Now that's real service. Stay safe, Katie." I hung up and returned to the operations center, where 18 people waited for my analysis of communications intercepts that would help determine which locations received Tomahawk missiles in the next 6 hours. Real service. By 2010, I'd risen to commander and was assigned to the Pacific Fleet's Intelligence Directorate in Norfolk, Virginia. That April, Somali pirates seized the MV Maersk, Alabama, and took 12 American sailors hostage. The world watched. Washington demanded results, and I found myself in a crisis room with 15 senior officers, including Colonel Richard Coleman, who would later become the general who changed everything. The Situation Room had no windows. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Maps covered the walls, satellite imagery of the Indian Ocean. Real-time tracking of the USS Bainbridge, positioned 500 meters from the lifeboat where pirates held our people. The deadline, 6 hours until the pirates executed hostages. Washington's order was clear: rescue the hostages, no casualties. The room debated approaches. 10 officers favored waiting until dawn, negotiating, buying time. 4 wanted immediate action, high risk, but the element of surprise. Coleman turned to me. "Commander Morrison, what do you recommend?" I studied the thermal imaging data, weather reports, psychological profiles of the pirate leader. Then I spoke. Neither option optimizes success probability. I propose a third approach. Wait 2 hours. 0330 is optimal. Pirates will be exhausted, least alert. Use thermal imaging to pinpoint exact positions. 3 snipers, 3 angles, simultaneous shots. Success probability, 73%. Hostage survival, 91%. A lieutenant colonel objected. 73% isn't good enough. It's the highest probability we can achieve. Dawn attack drops to 45%. Immediate action, 38%. This is the best mathematics available. Coleman studied me for 30 seconds that felt like 30 minutes. Then he nodded. We execute Morrison's plan, prepare the teams. At 0327, 3 shots rang out across dark water. 3 pirates died instantly. 12 hostages emerged unharmed. 0 American casualties. Afterward, Coleman called me to his office alone. "Commander, you just saved 12 lives. I won't forget that. You deserve recognition." But I couldn't receive public recognition. The operation was classified secret. No medal ceremony, no press conference, no acknowledgement beyond the people in that room who'd witnessed the decision. I called my father 3 days later, when the news had moved on to other stories. "How are you, Katie?" "I'm well, busy week." "I can imagine." "Did you hear about Michael? His SEAL team completed a mission in Iraq, got a commendation. We're so proud." That's wonderful. Tell him congratulations. Will do. What about you? Anything new? I looked around my Norfolk hotel room, the temporary quarters they'd assigned, while I debriefed the Somalia operation. Anything new? 12 people were alive because of a decision I'd made with incomplete information and 20 minutes to analyze it. Just the usual, Dad. Nothing exciting. Well, keep your head down. Stay safe. We hung up. I sat on the edge of the bed and understood with crystalline clarity that this would be my life. The more important my work became, the less I could discuss it. And the less I discussed, the more convinced he became that I had nothing worth discussing. The gap between us widened like continental drift, so slowly you couldn't perceive movement, but irrevocable nonetheless. By 2015, I'd achieved something only a fraction of military officers ever reach. Rear Admiral, 1 star, Director of Strategic Naval Intelligence. I commanded analysts, shaped policy, briefed the Secretary of Defense. My security clearance was top secret, sensitive, compartmented information, the highest level in the American intelligence apparatus. I held 73 classified secrets that would remain sealed for decades after my death. My promotion ceremony was held in a secure conference room in Washington, D.C. 30 people attended, all cleared personnel, all aware of what the rank signified. My mother wasn't there. My father wasn't there. Michael wasn't there. I hadn't invited them. How could I? The ceremony was classified. The work was classified. My entire professional existence had become information that couldn't be shared with the people who'd given me life. That night, alone in a DC hotel room, I lay awake listening to traffic hum through sealed windows and wondered what it would feel like to be known, not praised, not celebrated, just known. To have my father understand that his daughter had spent 30 years in rooms where decisions carried the weight of lives, where silence was strategy, where invisibility was the price of significance. I was 53 years old, a Rear Admiral in the United States Navy, and my father thought I'd dropped out. 5 years later, I retired. The ceremony was small, dignified, attended by colleagues who understood what my service had meant even if they couldn't discuss the specifics. I received a flag, formal thanks, and a pension that reflected the responsibility I'd carried. I bought the Alexandria penthouse with cash, $2.4 million for 3,000 square feet overlooking the Potomac. I furnished it with care. Mid-century modern pieces, original artwork, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with histories and biographies. I could finally live in a space that reflected who I was rather than who I needed to appear to be. My father called 2 weeks after I moved in. Katie, Michael mentioned you retired. Congratulations, I guess. Thank you. What will you do now? I looked around my penthouse, the view of the river, the art I'd collected from 3 decades of careful acquisition, the life I'd built in margins and silence. What would I do? I'd already been approached by 2 defense contractors offering consulting work. I had investment income that exceeded most people's salaries. I had knowledge, experience, networks. I'm not sure yet, Dad, exploring options. Well, don't wait too long. You're not getting any younger. Would be nice if you settled down, found someone. Your mother worries. I closed my eyes. 58 years old, retired as a Rear Admiral, financially secure beyond anything he'd achieved. And his concern was whether I'd found a husband. I'll keep that in mind. 6 months later, the invitation arrived. Michael Morrison would receive the Distinguished Service Medal on November 15, 2024, at Naval Base San Diego. The ceremony would honor 5 SEALs whose service exemplified the highest traditions of the Navy. I held the email for 3 days before responding. Did I want to go? I hadn't seen my family in 3 years. Not since my uncle's funeral, where my father had introduced me to distant relatives as his daughter, who'd retired early from government work for health reasons. But Michael was my brother. Whatever narrative our father had constructed, Michael had earned this recognition through his own dedication and sacrifice. He deserved to have his sister there, even if that sister had to sit in the back and pretend to be someone she wasn't. I replied, I'll be there. The morning of the ceremony, I woke at 7 in my Hilton San Diego hotel room. I ordered coffee and eggs, ate efficiently, and dressed with deliberate care. Navy blazer, Ralph Lauren, $800. Black slacks, Armani, $450. Ferragamo heels 3 inches, $650. the Omega watch Michael had given me a decade ago, back when he'd still asked what I did, and I'd still tried to find words that honored both truth and security clearances. Total outfit cost, approximately $2,000. Expensive enough to signal competence, restrained enough to avoid drawing attention. The uniform of a woman who'd learned that power doesn't announce itself. By 10:15, I was in a taxi heading to the base. The driver caught my eye in the mirror. "You here for the ceremony, ma'am? Got family receiving a medal?" "My brother." "Wonderful, you must be so proud." I smiled, very proud. What I didn't say, I was proud of Michael. I'd always been proud of him. He'd chosen a demanding path and walked it with honor. The fact that our father could see his accomplishments while remaining blind to mine didn't diminish either of our service. We'd both given ourselves to something larger. We'd just done it in different light. The base was exactly as I remembered. Ordered, purposeful, every structure built for function rather than beauty. The ceremony hall could hold 500 people. American and naval flags stood sentry on either side of the stage. Chairs marched in perfect rows, aligned with the kind of precision that separated military spaces from civilian ones. I chose a seat in the last row, 3 chairs from the right. From there, I could see everything while being seen by almost no one. Old habits. In intelligence work, you learn to occupy positions that maximize information while minimizing exposure. The hall filled gradually. Families carried programs like hymnals. Mothers clutched tissues in anticipation. Fathers stood straighter than usual, chests expanded with reflected glory. Everyone understood they were witnessing something earned. At 10:55, my family entered. My father wore his funeral suit, the one that made him look like the man he'd always believed himself to be. Solid, respectable, worthy of deference. He shook hands with people he didn't know, his voice carrying across the space. James Morrison, father of Michael Morrison, the seal being honored today. My mother followed in a pale dress, her purse clutched in both hands, her smile gentle and practiced. At 79, she'd perfected the art of being present without occupying space, of supporting without claiming territory. I recognized the skill. I'd learned it from watching her. Michael stood near the front with Jessica and their children. Even in civilian clothes, he carried the particular stillness that comes from years of training, that strip away every unnecessary movement. Jake and Emma, both young and healthy, looked around with the nervous pride of people who understand they're witnessing something significant, but aren't yet sure what it will demand of them. I watched from my corner as my father engaged the man in the business suit. Local official, probably, based on the easy confidence with which he occupied space meant for dignitaries. Their voices carried. Sound in enclosed spaces behaves predictably if you know how to listen. "Mr. Morrison, you must be incredibly proud. The Distinguished Service Medal." My father's face opened into pleasure. Proud doesn't begin to cover it. Michael's been exceptional since childhood. I always knew he'd accomplished something meaningful. "Do you have other children?" The pause lasted less than a second. Most people wouldn't have registered it. But I'd spent 3 decades in rooms where microexpressions determined whether intelligence was reliable or manufactured. I saw the calculation. "I have a daughter, Catherine. She was in the Navy briefly." "Really? She served too? That's remarkable." My father's smile held, but something behind it shifted, some small recalibration of how much truth to offer. "Well, she tried. Left after a couple of years. Couldn't handle the pressure." His voice dropped to confidence-sharing volume. "You know how it is. Some people are built for this life. Others discover it's not for them." The official murmured something diplomatic. "She does something with education now, I believe. Retired early, lives alone somewhere in Virginia." He paused, as if trying to remember details that had never been important enough to retain. "We don't talk frequently. Different lives, you understand." I felt the words land with their familiar weight. Not pain. Pain requires surprise. And I'd stopped being surprised decades ago. Just the old recognition that some distances can't be bridged because they exist in the space between what someone sees and what they're willing to perceive. My father continued, warming to the subject of his successful child. "Michael, though, look at him. Good income, stable family, distinguished record. That's what service looks like when it's done properly. Good income, $95,000 annually. My pension alone exceeded that by $90,000. Stable family, I'd chosen a different stability. the kind that comes from self-sufficiency rather than partnership. Distinguished record, Michael had earned his medals through courage and dedication. I'd earned mine through decisions made in classified rooms where courage looked like accepting that no one would ever know what I'd prevented. But my father didn't know any of that, because he'd never asked. And I'd stopped trying to explain when I realized that for him, not knowing was easier than acknowledging what knowing would demand. The ceremony began at precisely 11:15. Everyone rose for the national anthem, hands over hearts. In that moment, we were all equal. Parents and children, officers and civilians, people who'd served and people who'd loved those who served. Then General Richard Coleman stepped to the podium. At 62, with 3 silver stars on his uniform, and 35 years of service behind him, Coleman carried authority the way some people carry breath, essential, inevitable, requiring no performance. I'd worked with him 15 years ago during the Somalia crisis. He'd trusted my analysis when others had doubted. He'd chosen mathematics over emotion and saved 12 lives because of it. His eyes swept the audience. Front rows of dignitaries, middle rows of families, back rows of people who'd come to witness but not be witnessed. When his gaze reached the last row, it stopped. Just for a moment. Just long enough for recognition to pass between 2 people who'd sat together in windowless rooms making decisions that determined who lived and who came home. He knew I was here, and I knew that he knew. And in that exchange, something shifted. Some decision made in the half-second before he returned his attention to the prepared remarks. "Ladies and gentlemen," Coleman began, his voice carrying the weight of everything he'd seen and chosen not to speak about. "Today, we honor individuals who exemplify the highest standards of naval service. But before we proceed, I want to acknowledge something important." The room held its breath without knowing why. Service takes many forms. Some serve on front lines, others serve in secure rooms, making decisions that keep frontline personnel alive. Some receive public recognition. Others work in classified shadows their entire careers. And we never know what disasters they prevented or which crises they resolved before anyone else knew they existed. I felt my pulse slow and steady, the way it always did before something irrevocable happened. This wasn't part of the standard ceremony script. This was Coleman choosing to break protocol. "Before we honor today's medal recipients," he continued, his gaze moving deliberately back to the last row, back to me, "I want to recognize someone in this room whose service taught me that intelligence and discipline matter as much as courage." 500 people began turning in their seats, searching. My father's head tilted slightly, curious but not concerned. My mother's hands tightened on her purse. Michael's posture shifted, the minute adjustment of someone sensing something unexpected approaching. Coleman's eyes locked on mine. "Rear Admiral Morrison, you're here." For one suspended heartbeat, nothing happened. The words floated in air that had suddenly become thick, difficult to breathe. Then, like a wave responding to a command it had been waiting for, 200 Navy SEALs rose to their feet. Not scattered, not uncertain. Unified, reflexive, simultaneous. Chairs scraped, boots aligned, hands lifted in salute. The sound wasn't loud, but it was absolute. I remained seated for 3 seconds, not from confusion, but from needing ground beneath me to hold before I stood. Then I rose slowly, with the same controlled deliberation I'd used in 30 years of classified briefings, and met Coleman's eyes across the length of the hall. He nodded once, I nodded back. No words needed. We'd sat together while 12 lives hung in balance, and he'd chosen to trust my analysis over his instinct. That kind of trust doesn't require speeches. Behind me, I felt the air change, felt the exact moment my father understood what was happening. I turned my head just enough to see him. He'd stood when everyone stood, but he wasn't standing in respect. He was standing because his legs had stopped working, and standing was the only thing preventing collapse. His face had drained of color entirely, from healthy pink to something closer to ash. His mouth opened, closed, opened again, without producing sound. His hands, which had been so confident shaking strangers' hands minutes earlier, now trembled against his sides. It wasn't the look of a man who'd been proven wrong. It was the look of a man watching 30 years of narrative disintegrate in front of 500 witnesses. My mother's hand covered her mouth, her eyes wide and filling. Not anger, shock layered with something that might have been recognition. The sudden understanding that she'd lived decades beside a story, with a gap she'd never tried to fill, because filling it would have required asking questions she'd learned not to ask. Michael stared at me, then at Coleman, then at the 200 SEALs standing at attention. His face held the expression of someone whose world had just rearranged itself, and who didn't yet understand the new geography. The ceremony continued. Coleman resumed his remarks as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. Names were called, medals were presented. The machinery of recognition turned with its usual precision. But something fundamental had broken. A story that had held for 3 decades had collapsed. And now the question wasn't whether truth had arrived. The question was what we would build from the ruins. The SEALs settled back into their seats with the same disciplined precision they'd used to stand. No rushing, no disorder, just the controlled return to stillness that comes from bodies trained to move only when movement serves purpose. But the air had changed. Something invisible had shifted in the molecular structure of the room, leaving behind a charge that made breathing feel different, heavier, like atmosphere before lightning. Coleman continued speaking about tradition and sacrifice, his voice steady as if the last 90 seconds had been entirely ordinary. In the intelligence world, this was called operational continuity, the ability to absorb disruption without visible reaction, to incorporate the unexpected into existing frameworks so smoothly that observers question whether anything unusual happened at all. But it had happened. 500 people had witnessed it, and now they sat with that knowledge, unsure what it meant or what they were supposed to do with it. I remained standing for 5 seconds longer than necessary. Not for drama, but because my legs needed confirmation they would hold before I trusted them. Then I lowered myself back into the chair, hands folded in my lap, face composed. 30 years of classified briefings had taught me that reactions matter less than what comes after reactions. The moment itself is just information. What you do with that information determines everything that follows. 2 rows ahead, a woman turned to whisper to her husband. 3 rows over, a man pulled out his phone, then remembered where he was and put it away. The rustle of adjustment moved through the audience like wind through tall grass. Small disturbances that collectively signaled something large had occurred. My father remained frozen. From my angle, I could see the rigid line of his shoulders, the way his head stayed locked forward, as if turning it might confirm something he wasn't ready to acknowledge. My mother's hand had found his forearm, gripping with enough force that her knuckles showed white even from 20 rows back. She wasn't trying to comfort him. She was anchoring him, preventing some action or reaction that would make this moment worse than it already was. Michael stood with the other medal recipients, military bearing intact, but his eyes kept moving, toward Coleman, toward the audience, toward the back row where his sister sat in civilian clothes being addressed as Rear Admiral. His jaw worked slightly, the only outward sign that his internal landscape was undergoing tectonic revision. Coleman reached the formal portion of the ceremony, the part where names were called and service was quantified through medal and ribbon. The first recipient approached the stage. Applause followed, appropriate and measured. The machinery of recognition continued its programmed sequence. But everyone in that room understood they were watching 2 ceremonies now, the official one on stage and the unofficial one that had just concluded in the back row. The question was which one they would remember. A Navy captain sitting 3 seats to my left leaned slightly in my direction. His voice was pitched for discretion, but not quite a whisper. Admiral Morrison, Jim Reeves, attached to WARCOM. I've read your work on predictive threat modeling. Changed how we approach pre-deployment intelligence. I turned my head just enough to acknowledge him without encouraging extended conversation. Captain, didn't realize you'd be here. Thought you retired to the private sector. I did, 6 months ago. He nodded, processing. Must be strange sitting in the audience instead of the briefing room. Strange wasn't the word I would have chosen. Liberating, maybe, or disorienting, or both at once. The peculiar vertigo of being visible after 3 decades of practiced invisibility, of having your name spoken aloud in a space where you'd expected to remain unidentified. Different, I said. Well, it's an honor to meet you, ma'am. A lot of us owe our lives to decisions we never knew you made. The words landed with more weight than he probably intended, because that was the core truth of intelligence work. The people you saved never knew they needed saving. The crises you prevented never became crises, so no one remembered them. History is written by visible actors. The invisible ones get footnotes, if they're lucky. Thank you, Captain. He settled back into his seat, satisfied with the exchange. I returned my attention to the stage, where Michael was being called forward. Senior Chief Petty Officer Michael James Morrison, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against enemy forces. Coleman's voice carried through the hall, recounting actions I didn't have clearance to know about in detail but could infer from the language. High-risk operation. Personnel extracted under fire. Leadership under extreme conditions. The kind of service that looks heroic because it is heroic, because someone has to walk into danger when danger can't be avoided. I watched my brother accept his medal with the bearing that had been drilled into him through 2 decades of the most demanding training the military offers. He stood straight, faced forward, accepted recognition without false modesty or visible pride. Perfect form. When he returned to formation, his eyes found mine across the distance. Something passed between us. Not quite a question, not quite an acknowledgement. More like the first tentative probe of a sonar ping, testing depth and distance in water that had suddenly become unmapped. The ceremony concluded with closing remarks, the national anthem, and the formal dismissal. Applause rolled through the hall, building to a crescendo that felt almost desperate in its enthusiasm, as if everyone needed to fill the space with sound to process what silence would force them to confront. People rose and began moving toward the exits or toward the stage, forming clumps of conversation and congratulation. Families pressed forward to photograph their sons and daughters in uniform. Medals were touched with reverent fingertips. Babies were held up to see fathers they barely recognized in dress blues. I waited in my seat while the first wave passed. Old operational habit: never rush into compressed spaces when time allows for patience. Let the chaos organize itself, then move through the channels it creates. A young woman in navy dress uniform approached from my right. Lieutenant by her insignia, probably mid-20s, dark hair pulled back in regulation bun. She stopped at a respectful distance, not quite at attention, but not quite casual either. "Excuse me, ma'am, are you Admiral Morrison?" "I am." She took a breath, as if she'd rehearsed this moment, but the words were escaping her anyway. "I'm Lieutenant Sophia Martinez. I'm in Naval Intelligence. I wrote my master's thesis on your strategic assessment framework for asymmetric threats. It's an honor to meet you." The younger generation, raised in an era where women in military leadership were uncommon but not impossible, where the idea of a female admiral didn't require the same constant justification it had when I'd started. She didn't know what it had cost to build the framework she'd studied. She only knew it existed. "Thank you, Lieutenant. Where are you assigned?" "Bahrain, ma'am. 5th Fleet Intelligence Fusion Cell." I nodded. Bahrain, one of the most complex intelligence environments in the Navy's operational sphere. Iran, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, all within the area of responsibility. Maritime choke points, terrorist networks, state actors with conflicting agendas. The kind of assignment that would either break her or forge her into something formidable. Important work. Trust your analysis, even when senior officers question it, especially when they question it. Her eyes widened slightly. "Yes, ma'am, I will." She lingered for another moment, as if there were more she wanted to say but couldn't find the structure for. Then she nodded, offered a small smile, and withdrew back into the crowd. That was the part they didn't put in recruitment materials. The lonely burden of being right when everyone with more rank believes you're wrong. The years of having your assessments dismissed because you were too young, too female, too unconventional in how you'd reached your conclusions. The slow accumulation of being proven correct until people stopped questioning and started listening. I'd lived through that evolution. She was still in the early chapters. The hall had thinned enough now that movement became feasible. I stood, smoothed my blazer, and began making my way toward the exit. Several people nodded as I passed. A few offered quiet admiral greetings. Word had spread with the speed that information always spreads in military communities, through informal networks, lateral communication, the osmotic transfer of knowledge between people who understand that some things matter precisely because they're not officially announced. Near the front, Coleman intercepted me. Up close, the 15 years since we'd worked together showed in the deeper lines around his eyes, the complete silver of his hair. But his gaze held the same quality it always had, the particular clarity that comes from making decisions where all options carry cost, and the only question is which cost you're willing to accept. Catherine, not Admiral, not Morrison, just my first name, the privilege of shared history and mutual respect. Richard, I didn't know you'd be here. If I'd known, I would have. He trailed off, both of us aware that finishing the sentence would require acknowledging he'd made a choice in real time, an operational decision to break protocol because protocol was serving the wrong objective. You did what needed doing, I said. No explanation required. He studied me for a moment. Your father didn't know. It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. No, he didn't. That must have been difficult, all those years. Difficult was one word for it. But Coleman understood classified work, understood the spaces between what you wanted to share and what operational security permitted. He'd made similar choices, told similar partial truths to family members who loved him, but couldn't be cleared to know what he actually did. It was the job, I said. Still, you deserved recognition long before today. I thought about that, about what recognition meant, about whether it mattered. In the moment when those seals had stood, I'd felt something shift inside me, some weight I hadn't known I was carrying suddenly redistributing its mass. Not gone, but balanced differently. Recognition didn't change what I'd done or who I'd been, but it changed how I stood in the world, knowing that at least some people understood. Thank you for today. It wasn't necessary, but I'm grateful. Coleman glanced toward the front of the room, where families were gathering for photographs. Your brother's receiving line is forming. You should go see him. In a moment, he nodded, understanding that some approaches require calculation, that walking into a space where your presence will cause reaction demands, preparation. Catherine, if you ever want to consult, advise, anything like that, you know where to find me. Your mind is too valuable to spend retirement idle. I'll keep that in mind. We shook hands, the firm, brief grip of military professionals who respected each other enough not to waste time on elaborate gestures. Then he moved toward the stage, where his duties as presiding officer still required him to fulfill certain social obligations. I turned toward the exit, intending to leave before the inevitable confrontation with my father. Some conversations needed walls and privacy, needed space where raised voices wouldn't echo across 500 people's memories. But I'd waited too long. Katie. My mother's voice, softer than the ambient noise but cutting through it anyway because I'd been trained from birth to respond to that particular frequency. Katie, wait. I stopped, turned. She stood 5 feet away, purse clutched in both hands, makeup slightly smudged where she'd touched her eyes. Behind her, my father remained in his seat, staring at the program in his hands as if it might contain instructions for what to do when your world inverts. Mom, I didn't know. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word. All these years, I didn't know what you... We thought you'd... I know what you thought. She took a step closer, close enough that I could see the fine tremor in her hands, the way age and shock had conspired to make her suddenly fragile in a way she'd never seemed before. Why didn't you tell us? The question held 30 years of confusion, hurt, missed opportunities. But it was the wrong question. The question wasn't why I hadn't told them. The question was why they'd never asked, why they'd accepted a story that required so little of them, why silence had been easier than curiosity. But she was 79 years old, standing in a military hall where her daughter had just been acknowledged as something she couldn't have imagined. And breaking her further served no purpose. My work was classified, Mom. I couldn't discuss it. And after a while, I searched for words that would be true without being cruel. After a while, it seemed easier to let the story stand than to keep trying to explain what I couldn't explain. But Rear Admiral, you were an admiral! She said it like the word belonged to a foreign language she'd heard but never learned to speak. How did we not know? Because I worked in intelligence. Most of what I did will remain classified for decades. There were no public ceremonies, no newspaper articles, no way for anyone outside my immediate command to know what I was doing or how far I'd risen. My mother's face crumpled slightly, some internal structure giving way. I'm so sorry, Katie. We should have. Your father should have. Is he ready to talk? I glanced past her to where my father sat, shoulders curved forward in a posture I'd never seen him adopt, defeat or contemplation, or the physical manifestation of a man whose certainty had been stripped away, leaving only the question of what comes after certainty dies. I don't know. He hasn't said anything since the general. She couldn't finish, couldn't find words for what Coleman had done and what it had meant. Tell him I'm staying at the Hilton downtown, room 412. If he wants to talk, he can call. But Mom, I won't have this conversation in public, and I won't have it if he's not ready to listen. She nodded, understanding the boundaries I was setting, the terms under which reconciliation might be possible. I'll tell him. I touched her shoulder lightly, the brief physical contact that was all either of us had ever been comfortable with. Then I continued toward the exit, walking the line between leaving quickly and appearing to flee. But Michael caught me before I reached the door. He'd broken away from the receiving line, still in his dress blues, metal pinned precisely 2 inches above his left breast pocket. Up close, I could see the operational years written in the fine scars near his hairline, the particular weathering that comes from wind and sand and salt water. He'd aged into his role, the older brother who'd always been the visible one, the celebrated one, now looking at his sister like she was a stranger wearing a familiar face. Kate, Michael, congratulations, you earned this. He glanced down at his medal, then back at me. Did I? I mean, yeah, I did the work, but you... Rear Admiral. How is that even possible? I was good at my job, I got promoted, standard career progression. He shook his head, not buying the simplification. Don't do that, don't minimize it. You were a flag officer. There are only, 200 admirals in the entire Navy at any given time, out of 300,000 personnel. 220 last count. And yes. So you were in the top 0.07%, and we didn't know. Dad didn't know. His voice carried bewilderment more than accusation, the sound of someone trying to reconcile 2 incompatible versions of reality. He's been telling people for 30 years that you dropped out, that you couldn't handle it. I know. Why didn't you correct him? The same question my mother had asked, coming from a different angle. But Michael was military. He understood operational security, understood that some information couldn't be shared even with family. What he didn't understand was why I'd let the false narrative persist once I'd retired, once classification was no longer the barrier. Because by the time I could have corrected him, the story had become part of how he understood himself. He needed me to be the one who failed so he could be the one who succeeded. Taking that away would have required him to rebuild his entire self-concept. I wasn't willing to force that on him. Michael absorbed this with the same focused attention he probably brought to tactical briefings. That's incredibly generous, or incredibly sad. Maybe both. Maybe both, I agreed. He looked toward our father, still seated, still motionless. He's destroyed right now. You know that, right? His whole world the general said your name and his whole world collapsed. I know. Are you going to talk to him? If he wants to talk. But, Michael, I need you to understand something. I didn't come here to expose him. I came here because you're my brother and you deserve to have family present when you receive this recognition. What happened with Coleman? I didn't ask for that. He made a choice. Why did he do it? Why acknowledge you in the middle of my ceremony? I considered how much to share, how much Michael could understand without having been in the rooms where Coleman and I had worked together. Because 15 years ago, we were on a joint operation, hostages in Somalia. I developed the tactical plan that brought everyone home alive. He remembered that. And when he saw me sitting in the back while Dad told strangers I'd failed, he decided recognition was overdue. Michael's expression shifted through several emotions too quickly to catalog. You saved lives, actual lives, and we thought you pushed papers in some admin office. Intelligence officers don't push papers. We analyze information that determines whether operations succeed or fail, whether people live or die. It's not frontline work, but it's not administrative work either. He ran a hand across his face, the gesture of someone physically trying to wipe away confusion. I have so many questions. I know, and I'll answer what I can, but not here. Not now. I glanced around the hall, still populated with dozens of people who would remember this conversation, who would turn it into gossip and speculation. Give me your number. We'll find time to talk properly. He pulled out his phone, And we exchanged information with the awkward formality of siblings who'd become strangers through 3 decades of divergent paths. When we finished, he looked at me with something that might have been regret, or might have been the beginning of understanding. I'm sorry, Kate, for not asking, for not pushing back when Dad said those things, for just accepting the story. You were a kid when it started. By the time you were old enough to question, the pattern was set. You have nothing to apologize for. Still, I should have known you're my sister. I thought about all the ways family members could know each other, or fail to know each other. About how proximity wasn't the same as understanding. About how love and blindness could coexist in the same heart. Now you know. What you do with that knowledge is what matters. He nodded slowly. Then, in a movement that surprised us both, he stepped forward and embraced me. Not the brief, formal hug of ceremony, but the tight grip of someone trying to close distance that had grown too wide. His voice, when it came, was rough at the edges. I'm proud of you. I should have said that years ago, but I'm saying it now. I'm proud of you. Something in my chest tightened and released at the same time, a knot I hadn't known existed suddenly loosening, not disappearing but shifting enough that breathing came easier. Thank you. And Michael, I'm proud of you too. What you've done, who you've become. That's real, that's worthy. Don't let today's revelations diminish your own accomplishments. We separated, both of us slightly embarrassed by the display of emotion in a space designed for stoicism. He returned to his receiving line. I finally made it to the exit. The parking lot blazed with afternoon sun, hot enough that the asphalt seemed to shimmer. Families were loading into cars, children running between vehicles with the released energy of people who'd been forced to sit still for too long. Somewhere nearby, someone was grilling, the smell of charcoal and seasoned meat drifting on desert air. I stood beside my rental car and let the heat soak through my blazer, grounding myself in physical sensation while my mind processed everything that had happened in the last 2 hours. I'd come expecting to sit quietly, bear witness to my brother's achievement, and leave without incident. Instead, I'd been publicly acknowledged, had my 3-decade anonymity stripped away, had forced my father into confrontation with a truth he'd spent 30 years avoiding. Unintended consequences. In intelligence work, we called it blowback. When an operation creates effects beyond its intended scope, when actions ripple outward in ways the original planners never anticipated. My phone vibrated. Unknown number, San Diego area code. I almost didn't answer. But 30 years of training had conditioned me to treat unexpected communications as potentially significant. Admiral Morrison. Admiral Morrison, this is Captain Elena Rodriguez, JAG Corps. General Coleman asked me to reach out. Her voice was crisp, professional, the tone of someone who'd been given a task and intended to execute it efficiently. He mentioned you might be interested in consulting opportunities, defense contractors, threat assessment firms, that sort of work. Coleman moving quickly, opening doors before I decided whether I wanted to walk through them. Typical of his operational style, create options, then let people choose how to use them. I appreciate the outreach, Captain. Can you send information to my email? Of course, ma'am. I'll have a packet to you by end of business today. She paused. If I may say so, it's an honor to speak with you. Your work on counterterrorism intelligence architecture is required reading in our legal training now. Required reading. My frameworks had become institutional knowledge, passed down to new generations who would never know I developed them during 72-hour work weeks in windowless offices, while my family thought I'd quit. Thank you, Captain. After she hung up, I sat in the car with the air conditioning running, watching families celebrate in the shimmering heat. A little girl in a pink dress ran circles around her father while he tried to unlock their car. A teenage boy in a too large suit jacket looked at his phone and smiled at something only he could see. An older couple held hands as they walked slowly toward the parking lot exit, their pace accommodating the limits of age and the weight of relief that their son or daughter had returned from deployment one more time. Normal life, continuing its normal patterns, while I sat in the peculiar suspension of someone whose life had just changed shape in ways I couldn't yet measure. My phone rang again, this time a number I recognized. My father's cell phone, which he used primarily for emergencies and accidentally calling people while the phone was in his pocket. I stared at the screen through 3 rings, 4. Answering would start something. Not answering would be its own kind of answer. On the 5th ring, I answered. Silence on the other end. Not empty silence, but the weighted kind, full of presence and uncertainty. Then finally, his voice. Smaller than I'd ever heard it, stripped of the certainty that had defined every interaction I could remember. Katie, can we? A pause that stretched until I could hear him breathing, could hear the effort it was taking to push words through whatever had lodged in his throat. Can I see you? To talk? This was the moment, the hinge point. I could say no, could protect the equilibrium I'd built over 3 decades of managed distance. Or I could say yes, could step into the chaos of reconstruction, could risk everything I'd carefully insulated falling apart. But some risks are worth taking. Some doors, once opened, deserve to be walked through even when you can't see what's waiting on the other side. I'm at the Hilton downtown, room 412. Come whenever you're ready. But Dad, come ready to listen. Not to defend, not to explain, to listen. Another long silence. Then quietly, okay. The line went dead. I sat in the parking lot for another 10 minutes, watching the last families pack up and drive away, watching the hall empty and the parking spaces clear, watching the ordinary world continue its ordinary processes while I tried to prepare for a conversation 30 years in the making. Eventually, the heat became unbearable, even with air conditioning. I drove back to the hotel. The route automatic, my mind already running scenarios the way it had run operational scenarios for 3 decades. If he says this, I respond with that. If he deflects, I redirect. If he breaks down, I hold space for him to rebuild. But people aren't operations. Family isn't tactical. And sometimes the only way forward is to step into uncertainty without a plan. The hotel room was exactly as I'd left it. Bed made, laptop on the desk, the view of San Diego's downtown skyline stretching toward the harbor. I changed out of my blazer into something more comfortable, ordered coffee from room service, and waited. He arrived 90 minutes later, 3 soft knocks, hesitant, so different from the confident way he usually announced his presence. I opened the door. My father stood in the hallway looking diminished, not physically smaller, but somehow less solid, as if the substance that had always filled his frame had partially evaporated. He'd removed his jacket, his tie hung loose. His eyes were red in a way that suggested he'd been crying, which was something I'd never witnessed in 58 years of being his daughter. Come in. He entered slowly, taking in the room the way someone might examine unfamiliar territory. His gaze caught on my laptop, government-grade encryption visible on the lid sticker, then moved to the stack of books on the nightstand, all related to intelligence analysis and geopolitical strategy. Evidence of a life he'd never imagined, sitting in plain sight. We stood awkwardly for a moment, neither sure of the protocol for this situation. Finally, I gestured to the desk chair, while I took the armchair near the window. He sat, looked at his hands, looked at the floor, looked anywhere except directly at me. I don't know what to say. His voice was hoarse, worn down by whatever he'd been processing in the 90 minutes between phone call and arrival. I don't know where to even start. Start with the truth. Not what you wish had happened, not what you thought happened, just what actually happened. He took a shaking breath. I told people you dropped out. For 30 years, I told them you couldn't handle military life, that you'd quit. I told them you were doing something in education, that we didn't talk much. I made you small in my stories so I could. He stopped, choking on whatever word came next. So you could feel like the successful parent, I finished. So Michael's achievements reflected on you in ways you understood, while my silence could be interpreted as failure. He flinched. Yes. And you never asked. In 30 years, you never once asked what I actually did, where I actually was, why I couldn't talk about my work. You just assumed. I assumed because not knowing felt like you didn't think I was worthy of knowing, like you didn't trust me. His hands twisted together, knuckles white, and that hurt. So I told myself stories that made the hurt make sense. This was the core of it, finally exposed. He'd experienced my silence as rejection. And rather than ask why the silence existed, rather than push through discomfort to understanding, he'd created a narrative where the silence confirmed his worst fears about himself, that his daughter had surpassed him in ways he couldn't comprehend, so she must have failed instead. My work was classified, Dad. Top secret, sensitive compartmented information. I literally could not tell you what I did, where I worked, who I reported to. It wasn't about trust. It was about law. People go to prison for sharing that kind of information with family members who don't have clearance. He nodded, but I could see him struggling with the concept, trying to fit it into his framework of how the world worked. But you retired 6 months ago. You could have told us then. Could have. But by then you'd been telling the failure story for 3 decades. It had become part of your identity, part of how you understood your life. I didn't want to take that away from you. His head snapped up, eyes finally meeting mine. That's why you didn't correct me, because you were protecting me? Because forcibly revising someone's entire self-narrative is cruel. And because I'd built a life that didn't depend on your approval or recognition. Your story about me didn't change what I'd accomplished or who I'd become. A sound escaped him. Half laugh, half sob. You're talking about cruelty, about protecting me. When I spent 30 years telling strangers my daughter was a quitter. When I made you invisible. Tears spilled over now, running unchecked down his face. Katie, what I did to you. There's no excuse. None. No, there isn't. The bluntness seemed to break something in him. His shoulders shook. His breath came in gasps. He cried the way men cry when they've spent lifetimes holding everything in and the dam finally cracks. Ugly, raw, total. I waited. This wasn't something I could fix or should fix. This was his reckoning with himself, with the gap between who he'd believed himself to be and what his actions had actually created. When he could speak again, his voice came out wrecked. How do I fix this? How do I make this right? You can't fix it. The past happened. The words were said. The story was told. I leaned forward, making sure he heard what came next. But you can choose what story you tell going forward. You can choose whether the next 30 years repeat the last 30, or whether something different gets built from here. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, a gesture so vulnerable it made him look ancient. I want different. I want to know you, the real you. Not the story I told, not the daughter I imagined. You. That's going to be harder than you think, because you're going to learn things that make you uncomfortable, that challenge everything you believe about women and work and success. You're going to have to accept that your daughter was more powerful, more accomplished, more successful than you'll ever be. Can you live with that? The question hung between us, sharp and necessary. This was the real test, not whether he could apologize, but whether he could restructure his ego to accommodate a truth that diminished his own relative status. He was quiet for a long time, then slowly. I think the question is whether I can live without it. And the answer is no, I can't. Not anymore. He met my eyes fully for the first time since entering the room. Teach me, Katie. Teach me how to know you. Something shifted in my chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the first recognition that forgiveness might become possible if the work got done, if the commitment held. Okay, we can try. We didn't speak again for 3 days. Not because either of us was avoiding the other, but because some conversations need distance before they can be honest. I'd learned that in intelligence work, decisions made in the immediate aftermath of emotional events carried different weight than decisions made after the adrenaline cleared, after sleep restored perspective, after time created space between impulse and commitment. My father called on the 4th day, not to my cell phone, but to the hotel room landline, which suggested he'd been working up to this. Had dialed and hung up enough times to have memorized the number. Katie, could we have dinner? Just us. Your mother will be there, but I'd like to talk more, if you're willing. The formality in his voice was new. The careful phrasing of someone who'd learned he no longer had the right to assume welcome, who needed to ask rather than expect. It was a small thing, but small things often matter most in the architecture of changed relationships. When? Tonight, if you're free, at the house, 6 o'clock. I'd been planning to fly back to Alexandria that evening, had already extended checkout to accommodate the late flight, but some opportunities have expiration dates. And this one felt fragile enough that delaying might mean losing it entirely. I'll be there. The drive to my parents' house took 40 minutes through San Diego traffic that moved with the particular aggression of people who believed speed could compress time. I'd rented a car that morning, needing mobility more than I needed the convenience of taxis. Control, even in small measures, mattered when entering uncertain territory. The neighborhood hadn't changed since my last visit 3 years ago. Modest single-family homes built in the 1970s, lawns maintained to varying standards, cars that ranged from new to decades old, working-class respectability, the kind of area where people owned their houses outright and took pride in that ownership even when the paint peeled and the roof needed replacement. My parents' house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, the porch light already on, though sunset was still an hour away. My father's habit again. Better to illuminate what's coming than to be caught in darkness. I parked on the street, gathering myself before approaching. The last time I'd been here, I'd been the daughter who'd left the Navy, the one who'd disappointed, the footnote in family stories. Now I was something else entirely. And neither of us knew what shape that would take, or whether the foundation could bear the weight of truth. My mother opened the door before I could knock. She'd been crying, not recently, but within the last few hours, evidence visible in the slight swelling around her eyes and the careful way she'd reapplied makeup to cover the damage. "Katie, come in." The interior smelled like it always had. Furniture polish, the particular scent of old carpet, something cooking that involved garlic and tomatoes. My mother had set the dining table with her good dishes, the ones reserved for holidays and occasions that required formality. 3-place settings, carefully arranged, napkins folded into triangles. My father stood in this kitchen doorway, hands hanging loose at his sides like he'd forgotten what to do with them. He'd shaved recently, nicked himself in 2 places. The small cuts suggested unsteady hands, distraction, the physical manifestation of a mind elsewhere. "Katie?" "Dad." We stood in awkward tableau, 3 people who'd lived together for 18 years now, uncertain about basic proximities, whether to hug, shake hands, maintain distance. Finally, my mother made the decision for us, gesturing toward the living room. "Sit. Dinner's almost ready, but we should talk first." The living room had not changed either. Same couch, same coffee table, same family photos on the mantel documenting our progression through time. Michael and me as children, high school graduations, Michael's wedding, grandchildren I'd only met in pictures. I appeared in the early photos, then gradually faded from the narrative, until the last 15 years contained no evidence I'd existed at all. My father saw me looking at the photos. "I'm going to fix that. Add your pictures from your career. If you have any you can share." "I have some from my retirement ceremony. I can send them." He nodded, absorbing this detail into his revised understanding of who I'd been while he'd thought I was someone else. "I'd like that." My mother sat beside him on the couch, her hand finding his automatically, the gesture of 60 years of partnership. Whatever private conversations they'd had over the past few days had brought them to some kind of unified position, some agreement about how to approach this moment. "Katie, we need to apologize," she began, her voice steadier than I'd expected. "Both of us, not just your father." I started to object. She hadn't been the one spreading false narratives, hadn't been the architect of my public failure. But she cut me off with a raised hand. "Let me finish. Your father told the story, yes, but I stood beside him and said nothing. When people asked about you, I smiled and nodded and let them believe whatever they believed. I never pushed back. I never demanded he tell a different story. I was complicit in erasing you." The words landed with unexpected weight. I'd been so focused on my father's active fabrication that I'd never fully reckoned with my mother's passive participation, the sin of omission that had allowed the lie to calcify into accepted truth. "I told myself I was being loyal to your father," she continued, "that supporting him meant not contradicting him, even when I knew something was wrong. But loyalty shouldn't require silence when someone you love is being erased. I failed you as much as he did, maybe more, because I knew better." My father's hand tightened on hers. "Dorothy." "No, James. She needs to hear this from both of us." She turned back to me. "I had dreams once, too. I wanted to be a nurse. I was accepted to nursing school the year before we got married. But your father didn't think married women should work, and I was 19 and in love, and I thought love meant sacrifice. So I sacrificed." This part I'd known, or suspected. The ghost of her unlived life that occasionally flickered across her face when she watched medical dramas or read newspaper articles about hospital innovations. And then you came along. And you were so smart, Katie, so determined. You wanted to know how everything worked, why things were the way they were. You asked questions that made adults uncomfortable because you saw through the easy answers to the complicated truths underneath. Her eyes shone with unshed tears. I saw myself in you, the self I might have been if I'd chosen differently. And instead of encouraging you, instead of making sure you knew your worth, I stayed quiet, because saying the truth out loud would have meant admitting I'd wasted my own potential. The confession opened something in me I hadn't known was locked. Some old grief about my mother's silence, her failure to intervene when my father's dismissiveness could have been countered by her advocacy. But underneath the grief was recognition. She'd been trapped in her own way, caught between the world she'd been raised to accept and the world she'd helped create for the next generation. I don't blame you, Mom. You did what you thought you had to do. But I shouldn't have had to do it. That's what I'm trying to tell you. The fact that staying silent felt necessary, that supporting your father's ego felt more important than defending my daughter's truth. That's the problem, and I'm sorry. I'm so deeply sorry. My father had been sitting rigidly through this, but now he leaned forward, elbows on knees, face turned toward me with an expression I'd never seen him wear, raw vulnerability, the complete absence of the certainty that had always defined him. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. Why didn't you ever just tell me I was wrong? You could have. Even with the classified work, you could have said, Dad, you're telling people I failed and that's not true. Why didn't you fight back? I considered the question carefully, searching for the truth beneath the truth, because fighting back would have required me to prove myself to you. And I'd already spent my whole childhood trying to prove myself, trying to be seen, trying to earn the same attention and respect you gave Michael automatically. I was exhausted, Dad. And at some point, I realized that living well, accomplishing meaningful work, building a life I was proud of, that was victory enough. I didn't need you to acknowledge it. His face crumpled. But I should have acknowledged it. You're my daughter. I should have been the first person celebrating every promotion, every achievement, He broke off, overcome. Yes, you should have, but you didn't, and I survived that. I built a life anyway. The question now isn't what you should have done. It's what you're going to do going forward. He wiped his eyes roughly, the gesture of a man unaccustomed to crying in front of others. I want to know everything. I want to understand what you did, why it mattered, what it cost you. I want to know the daughter I never bothered to meet. That's going to take time, Dad, and some of it I still can't discuss. You'll have to accept gaps. I can live with gaps if the gaps are real, not just my unwillingness to ask. He straightened slightly, some of his old decisiveness returning. Will you stay for dinner? Will you help me understand? I looked at both of them, my father with his newly uncertain bearing, my mother with her lifetime of swallowed words finally being spoken. They were old. That fact struck me with unexpected force. My father was 82, my mother 79. They wouldn't live forever. The window for this reconstruction had limits, temporal boundaries that couldn't be negotiated. Yes, I'll stay. My mother stood with visible relief, heading toward the kitchen. Let me get dinner on the table. James, help me. They moved together with the synchronized efficiency of long partnership, leaving me alone in the living room with the photo gallery documenting our family's official history. I stood before the mantel, studying the progression, the gradual disappearance of my image, the way I'd been edited out of the visual record as thoroughly as I'd been edited out of the verbal one. But that could change now. The past couldn't be revised, but the present could be documented differently. The future could hold space for a daughter who'd been there all along, just invisible to eyes that hadn't been trained to see her. Dinner was simple. Spaghetti with meat sauce, garlic bread, salad, the food my mother had made throughout my childhood, comfort meals that required minimal skill and produced maximum satisfaction. We ate in the dining room, the good dishes somehow making the ordinary food feel ceremonial. Halfway through the meal, my father set down his fork with deliberate precision. Tell me what you actually did. Not the cover story, the real work. The real. The request came as both question and olive branch, permission to enter my professional life, trust that I would share what operational security allowed. I was an intelligence officer specializing in strategic analysis and threat assessment. I started in satellite imagery analysis, Soviet installations, naval deployments, things that required pattern recognition and predictive modeling. Later, I moved into operational planning, developing tactical approaches for high-risk missions. My father's eyes widened. You planned missions? Like actual combat operations? Mia? Intelligence officers don't plan combat operations directly. We provide the information that makes them possible: target locations, enemy capabilities, optimal timing, probability assessments. Then operational commanders decide whether to execute. But you were in the room when those decisions were made. Yes, for 30 years in various capacities at increasing levels of responsibility. My mother's hand had moved to her mouth. You were making decisions that affected whether people lived or died. That was my job. Every intelligence assessment carries that weight. Get it wrong and people die. Get it right and they come home. My father shook his head slowly. And we thought you pushed papers. We thought you'd quit because you couldn't handle pressure. But you were in crisis rooms making calculations that saved lives. I was one part of a large system. Success required analysts, operators, commanders, support personnel. Intelligence work is collaborative, not heroic. Stop diminishing it. His voice carried an edge now, frustration breaking through. You keep making it smaller than it is. You were a Rear Admiral. Do you know how few people achieve flag rank out of everyone who ever serves? About 0.07% of active duty personnel at any given time. Exactly. You were in the top fraction of a percent. And for 30 years, I told everyone you'd failed. He looked down at his plate, unable to hold eye contact. How do you even begin to apologize for that? You already started at the hotel, and you're doing it again now by asking instead of assuming, by listening instead of talking. We continued through dinner, the conversation ranging across decades of missed connections. My father asked about promotions, when they'd happened, why, what responsibilities came with each rank. My mother wanted to know about daily life, where I'd lived, what my routines had been, whether I'd been lonely. I answered what I could, painting in broad strokes where classification prevented detail, trying to give them a sense of scope without breaching security protocols I'd sworn to uphold even in retirement. When I mentioned the penthouse in Alexandria, my father's fork stopped midway to his mouth. You own your home outright? Right. I paid cash. It seemed simpler. He set down the fork carefully, as if sudden movements might shatter something fragile. I've spent 60 years paying off this house. You bought a home in one of the most expensive cities in America with cash. The cognitive dissonance is, he trailed off, shaking his head. Financial security was important to me. I invested carefully, lived below my means, prioritized long-term stability over immediate consumption. That's not just financial security, Katie. That's wealth, real wealth. He laughed, the sound slightly hysterical. My daughter is wealthy, accomplished, decorated, and I told people she was a quitter who couldn't make it. My mother reached across the table to take my hand. We can't give you back the time we wasted, but we can honor the time we have left. After dinner, we moved to the living room with coffee. My mother brought out photo albums from my childhood, and we flipped through them slowly. My parents occasionally stopping to comment on a particular picture or memory. You were always reading, my mother observed, pointing to a photo of me at age 7, curled in a chair with a book nearly as large as I was. Even at parties, you'd find a quiet corner and read. I liked understanding how things worked. That made you difficult sometimes, my father admitted. You asked questions I didn't have answers for. It was easier with Michael. He accepted what I told him. But you always pushed back, always wanted proof or logic or better explanations. Healthy skepticism, it's essential in intelligence work. He nodded slowly. I see that now. At the time, I just thought you were being difficult, challenging my authority. I was challenging your logic. There's a difference. There is. I didn't understand that then. The conversation deepened as the evening progressed, moving from surface questions to harder territory. The years I'd missed holidays, the times I'd been unreachable for weeks, the way distance had grown between us, not through conflict, but through accumulating absence. Did you resent us? My mother asked quietly. For not understanding, for not supporting you the way we should have? I thought about that carefully. Resentment was too sharp a word for what I'd felt. Grief, maybe. Resignation. The particular sadness that comes from accepting that people you love will never see you clearly, not because they lack capacity, but because they lack willingness. I resented the situation more than I resented you. I resented having to choose between career and family connection, between serving my country and maintaining relationships with people who couldn't know what that service entailed. But I made my choice, and I lived with the consequences. My father's voice came out hoarse. You shouldn't have had to choose. No, but the choice was mine to make, and I don't regret the life I built. I only regret that you never got to see it. He stood abruptly, walked to the window, stared out at the darkening street. When he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion he was barely controlling. I'm an idiot, a proud, stubborn idiot, who was so invested in being right that I couldn't see when I was catastrophically wrong. And you? You're so gracious about it, so willing to forgive when you have every right to tell me to go to hell. Telling you to go to hell doesn't serve anyone, and I don't want to spend whatever time we have left being angry about time we've already lost. He turned back to face me, tears running unchecked down his face. I don't deserve that generosity. Probably not, but I'm not offering it because you deserve it. I'm offering it because I deserve peace. And peace requires letting go of grievances, even legitimate ones. My mother was crying now too, quiet tears that spoke to decades of carrying guilt she'd never voiced. How do we move forward from here? What do you need from us? Honesty, curiosity, the willingness to ask instead of assume. And time, regular contact, phone calls, visits when it makes sense. I'm not asking for you to become different people, just to make space for the person I actually am. My father crossed the room and knelt in front of my chair, an old man getting down on arthritic knees because standing felt wrong for what he needed to say. I'm going to tell everyone the truth. Family, friends, everyone I lied to. I'm going to say I was wrong about my daughter. She didn't fail. She succeeded beyond anything I had the imagination to recognize. And if people judge me for that, if I look foolish or cruel or blind, good. I should look that way, because that's what I was. The gesture was enormous, terrifying in its implications. Admitting error privately was one thing. Admitting it publicly, to dozens of people who'd accepted his version of events for decades, required a kind of courage most people never accessed. Dad, you don't have to humiliate yourself publicly to make this right. Yes, I do. If I'm going to rebuild trust with you, I need to stop being the man who lied about his daughter. The only way to do that is to correct the lie everywhere it exists. He took my hands in his, grip trembling but firm. I can't give you back 30 years, but I can give you the truth going forward. That's all I have to offer, and I'm offering it. Something shifted in my chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the recognition that forgiveness might be possible if he continued this trajectory, if the commitment held beyond this moment of crisis. Okay, we can try. He squeezed my hands once more, then struggled to his feet, my mother helping him up. We stood in uncertain proximity for a moment. Then he stepped forward and embraced me. Not the brief courtesy hug of formal occasions, but the full contact grip of someone trying to communicate through pressure what words couldn't carry. I'm proud of you, he whispered against my shoulder. I should have said it every day for the last 30 years, but I'm saying it now. I'm so damn proud of you. Oh. The words I'd waited a lifetime to hear, arriving decades late but still carrying weight. I let myself lean into the embrace, let myself accept what was being offered even though it couldn't erase what had been withheld. Thank you, Dad. My mother joined the embrace, and for a long moment we stood there, 3 people trying to bridge a gap that had taken 30 years to create, knowing it would take more than one evening to fully cross it, but willing to make the attempt. When we separated, my mother walked me to the door. The porch light illuminated the path to my car, moths circling in its glow. Will you come back? Visit us properly when there's less weight to carry. Yes, we'll figure out a rhythm. Maybe I can come out in a few months, stay for a weekend. We'd like that. And Katie? She touched my cheek with a tenderness that felt both familiar and new, the touch of a mother who'd forgotten how to show affection and was relearning. Thank you for giving us another chance. Not everyone would. You're my parents. That doesn't go away just because things were broken. My father appeared in the doorway behind her. Drive safe. And Katie, call when you get home, so we know you made it. The request was so ordinary, so parental, that it almost broke something in me. This was what I'd missed all those years. Not grand gestures or public acknowledgement, but the small expressions of care that said you mattered enough to worry about. I will. I drove away slowly, watching them in the rearview mirror until I turned the corner. Two elderly figures standing on a porch, hands raised in farewell, growing smaller until they disappeared. The flight back to Alexandria left at 11. I returned the rental car, checked in, moved through security with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent decades traveling on military orders. The airport was quiet, populated mostly by business travelers and families returning from holiday visits. Everyone carrying the particular exhaustion that comes from emotional labor performed in compressed time frames. I found a seat at the gate and pulled out my phone. Michael had texted earlier. "How did it go?" I typed back. "Better than expected. We're going to try." His response came immediately. "Good. You all deserve that. Let's talk soon. I want to hear the real stories." "Soon," I confirmed. Boarding began 20 minutes later. I settled into my window seat, declined the flight attendant's offer of a beverage, and watched San Diego fall away beneath us as the plane climbed into darkness. Somewhere down there, my parents were probably still awake, processing everything that had been said and left unsaid, trying to incorporate a new understanding of their daughter into the framework of their lives. The work would take time. Some wounds required more than apologies to heal. They required sustained effort, repeated choice, the daily decision to build something new rather than retreat into comfortable old patterns. But for the first time in 30 years, I believed that building might be possible. The woman in the seat next to me was reading a thriller, occasionally glancing up when turbulence jostled the plane. She caught me looking and smiled. "Heading home?" "Yes." "Family visit?" "Something like that." She returned to her book, and I turned back to the window. Below, scattered lights marked cities and towns, evidence of millions of lives being lived in patterns I would never know. Somewhere in that darkness, people were having conversations that would change their relationships, making choices that would ripple forward into futures they couldn't predict. I'd spent 3 decades as an intelligence officer, trained to analyze patterns and predict outcomes, to see 3 moves ahead and prepare for contingencies. But family didn't follow predictable patterns. Reconciliation couldn't be modeled or gamed out. Sometimes you just had to step into uncertainty and trust that the ground would hold. The flight attendant came through with drinks. This time I accepted. Ginger ale, ice, something to occupy my hands during the remaining 3 hours to DC. My phone buzzed with an email. Captain Rodriguez, the JAG officer Coleman had mentioned, sending information about consulting opportunities, defense contractors, think tanks, academic positions for senior intelligence officers transitioning to civilian life. The subject line read, "Options for your next chapter." I skimmed the attachments quickly, then set the phone aside. Next chapter. That's what this was, wasn't it? Not an ending, but a transition. The Navy chapter had closed. The family reconciliation chapter was opening. And somewhere in between, I needed to figure out what Catherine Morrison looked like when she wasn't defined by rank, classification, or the need to remain invisible. The plane reached cruising altitude, and the cabin lights dimmed. Around me, passengers settled into various states of rest. Some sleeping, some reading, some staring at screens glowing in the darkness. I closed my eyes and let the engine noise become white noise, a backdrop for thoughts that were finally beginning to quiet. 30 years was a long time to carry silence. But silence, I'd learned, wasn't absence. It was simply information not yet shared, stories waiting for the right moment to be told, truths that needed proper context before they could be heard. Maybe that moment had finally come. When I opened my eyes again, we were beginning our descent into Reagan National. The Potomac was a dark ribbon below, and beyond it, Alexandria's lights marked home, the penthouse that represented freedom, security, the life I'd built on my own terms. But home was expanding now to include something I'd thought lost, connection with the people who'd raised me, imperfect and flawed as that connection might be. Family didn't have to mean perfection. It just had to mean willingness. And for the first time in 3 decades, we were all willing. The plane touched down smoothly. I gathered my belongings and joined the stream of passengers moving toward the terminal, toward baggage claim, toward the life waiting on the other side of arrival. My phone showed a missed call from my father and a voicemail. I listened as I walked. Katie, it's Dad. I know you said you'd call when you landed, but I just wanted to say thank you for tonight, for giving us a chance. Your mother and I, we know we have a lot of work to do, but we're ready to do it. So, call when you can. We love you. 3 words at the end that I couldn't remember him ever saying to me as an adult. We love you. Simple, direct, long overdue. I saved the voicemail and stepped out into the Virginia night. The air was colder here than it had been in San Diego, sharp with the promise of winter. I pulled my coat tighter and headed for the taxi stand, already planning the phone call I'd make once I got home. Because some victories aren't won through dramatic confrontation or public vindication. Sometimes they're won through quiet persistence, through the willingness to keep showing up even when you're not sure anyone sees you, through building a life so solid that recognition becomes optional rather than essential. I'd built that life. And now, finally, I had the chance to share it with the people who should have seen it all along. The taxi driver asked where I was heading. I gave him the Alexandria address and settled back into the seat, watching DC's monuments drift past, the Jefferson Memorial lit against the night sky, the Washington Monument standing sentinel, the Capitol Dome gleaming white. These were the symbols of the country I'd served for 30 years, the institutions I'd protected through work most people would never know about. I'd made that choice consciously, accepting invisibility as the price of significance. But some things didn't have to stay invisible forever. Some stories could be told in time to the people who mattered most. The taxi pulled up to my building. I paid, tipped well, and rode the elevator to the 15th floor. The penthouse was exactly as I'd left it. My books, my art, my carefully curated space. But it felt different now. Less like a fortress and more like a foundation. A place to return to, yes, but also a place to invite others into. A life not just lived but shared. I called my father from the window overlooking the Potomac. He answered on the first ring. You made it. I made it, safe and sound. A pause, filled with everything we'd said and everything still waiting to be said. Then, good, that's good. Sleep well, Katie. You too, Dad. After we hung up, I stood at the window for a long time, watching lights reflect off dark water, thinking about the strange mathematics of loss and recovery. 30 years couldn't be returned, but the years remaining could be lived differently. And sometimes that was enough. Sometimes rebuilding wasn't about restoring what was broken. It was about constructing something new from the pieces that remained, acknowledging the cracks, while choosing to call them character instead of damage. Outside, the city continued its endless motion. Cars crossing bridges, planes descending toward the airport, lives intersecting and diverging in patterns too complex to predict. And inside, a daughter who'd spent 30 years invisible was learning finally what it felt like to be seen.